you've got your people here. They okay. We will now turn to a discussion and presentation by the Army Corps of Engineers regarding the Groveland Avenue Levee, Section 205 Flood Risk Management Project. Welcome, Mr. Super.
Thank you, President Sells. Thank you, Board, for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I don't seem to have the pointer with me. Great.
You guys can slide over, trustees, if you want to slide over around so you can see.
What's in here? It's in a duck.
It's probably in your packet as well.
There we go.
Go back up. This is fun. All right. Here we go. All right. So most of this is going to be a rehash for some of us, but some of us are new on the board. So President Sells asked that I go through the progress of what we've done previously with a little bit of an update on the funding and the schedule and things like that. So what we're going to go through tonight is some of the background. That's going to be the main focus of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show you what the proposed levee looks like based on the original design. We'll talk about the project costs. I'll give you a funding update on what we've spent so far, and then also a proposed schedule. And then we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So the background on this, Groveland Avenue Levee came out of the Upper Des Plaines River and Tributaries, Illinois and Wisconsin study. This was a major study that was done for the entire Upper Des Plaines River watershed. Back in March 10th of 2014, the original proposal for that entire study was sent to our division commander and approved by that division commander at the time. At that point in time, because this was a continuing authorities program part of that study, this became authorized for us to request funding for. So about a year later, in 2015, we requested funding from our general funds that fund continuing authorities programs, $50,000 to negotiate a project partnership agreement with the Village of Riverside. In the process of that, we also involved the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District and IDNR. Through those negotiations, it became clear that the Village of Riverside was the perfect partner to work with on this. And we've met with you over the past several years to negotiate that, and there was a PPA that was eventually signed. So we have this cool video that unfortunately doesn't work on this computer, but I have the results of the video later on, and then we'll get back to that. So, you know, technology is great when it works, but when it doesn't, it's a little disappointing. But anyways, to get back to this, so this is what came out of the study. This is the general idea of what we had proposed. We were going to take the current Groveland Avenue levee, this green line here. The elevation that we seek to get to is 618 feet. So we're going to take 867 linear feet of sheet pile and raise this levee by 2 feet. It's currently sitting at about 616 for a majority of it. And so that would be sheet pile in this area here. South of Forest Avenue, we'd be adding a flood wall that connects in with the high ground of the railroad down here at the very southern end. Then we would originally look at raising Park Avenue as a road raise to provide the closure over into the high ground that starts over here at this road. And then Forest Avenue would also have a road closure. This prevents water from coming in from the river over the road. At the request of the village, we looked at it and we said, you know, this road raise actually is a lot of work. We have to take up a lot of Groveland. There's a lot of driveways and other things that would be impacted by this. So we said, you know what, we're just going to go with flood wall along Park Avenue. We think that that's a reasonable change. It's probably not just as cost effective. And so with the village's guidance, we looked at that and we think that that's something that we can accomplish. So what does a flood wall really look like? One of the big questions is what could this be in the future? So for the sheet pile wall, what we'd be looking at is something like this. This is a feature that we have on our Levee 37. This is sheet pile that's just sticking up out of the ground. That's approximately 1.5 to 2 feet with a steel cap over top of it. Would be what could be at the Groveland levee portion. This also could be capped with concrete. We could cast concrete around the top side of it to make it look more like the rest of the flood wall. Flood walls themselves can be more plain, like Levee 37, which is just a break fin type of finish. It's just like vertical lines that are a little bit rough. It's not super aesthetic, but it's not plain. But then we also have a little bit fancier, where we have here in the Little Cow flood wall. It looks more like a stone wall that has been constructed along with some cool intervening piers that make it look very, at least nicer than just a plain concrete wall. And it has like a shiny finish to it as well. So these are some of the options that we would look at, and it's part of the cost. Basically, when you cast a wall in place, it has a special liner that is put in the casting that creates this. It's a negligible expense, so it's not anything that would get passed on to the village.
Can I interrupt there just for a
go
second? Because I thought I remembered when you were here last that you said that aesthetic changes like that would be passed on to us. Now you're saying that something like having a different face to the wall would be included in...
Well, so the aesthetic of just this, the look of it itself would not be an increase in cost. There's also other more expensive options, like you paint it to look like stones. So when we're casting it, it's just gonna be gray. So it'll still be concrete, but it'll have a pattern to it. But you can go further, and you can go in and you can actually paint individual stone. Like I've seen places they paint them like red, black, and gray, and it makes it actually look like stone. This is more of a facade to it. So something like asking it to be painted so that it has the actual stone look to it, that's a cost that we would pass on. Okay. But in general, the idea of having a liner like this is cheap enough that we would just absorb the cost. Okay. It wouldn't increase the cost significantly enough to.
And do those decorative columns, are those included as well?
That I have to look at that. I'm not sure on that one, but most likely. I mean, the amount of concrete difference here versus what we would have in place otherwise is negligible. So most likely. This one, these are in places where it changes direction. There would be much fewer changes in direction in your wall, so you might not see it. It would be a, do you really want it or not? We'd have to talk about that.
Okay.
All right, so again, we have a cool video that doesn't work, but we do have the final results. So if we had been able to run the video, basically what you would have seen is we show in the past, this is all forest preserve area that floods very quickly. Eventually what happens is that the water starts to flow in down here in the West Avenue area, fills in this area, kind of starts to creep across here, and at the same time this is filling in and they meet in the middle and flood out this entire neighborhood over here. So if we were to build the flood wall, the results look more like this, where this is entirely protected. This area here stays the same, and we have all of the different features that are pretty much similar as if the flood wall was not there. One of the ways that we looked at that, one of the things that it does provide is $229,000 net annual benefits, so it is a positive benefit ratio, just above 1. And we looked at it, and it does not increase river levels upstream or downstream, and we'll demonstrate that here in a minute with a profile that we took that comes right through here. So we look at this profile to make sure that nothing impacts this neighborhood in this area here. And we looked at up and down the river. We just chose one that was very representative. One of the key things that we do want to point out is that at this point in time, we cannot guarantee that it meets the FEMA requirements for flood insurance relief. In general, FEMA requires at least a +3 foot above the 100-year, which is around 616. 618 is not there yet. FEMA does allow for the Corps of Engineers to do a risk analysis that allows us to use a lower level, and we've been able to get away with 2 feet in the past, but it's not a guarantee in any sense of the matter in terms of being able to eliminate this neighborhood. We can reduce the risk of them getting flooded, but we can't guarantee that they would necessarily be relieved from flood insurance requirements.
So how high up would you have to go to meet the FEMA requirement?
Well, and that's an analysis that we would have to do. I mean, in general, for FEMA requirements, if we went to the 3 feet, we'd have to go to 619. Unfortunately, 619 isn't available to tie into in this location over here. We're going to barely be able to get the 618. It's one of the things that we need to confirm yet. But you know, if we try to get to 619, we'd be building a wall somewhere off into these neighborhoods out this direction. Away from there, and that's just really, that gets very expensive because you're building between people's homes, and it's not really worthwhile overall.
Okay.
So the
Trustee, did you have a question?
Yeah.
All right. When would we know if it would meet the FEMA requirements?
Yeah, that is a great question. So as we've been looking at this with the new modeling and everything, we could go through and do an analysis where we would submit a conditional letter of map revision with FEMA, which basically takes this modeling and it looks at it and it says, what are the risks of a wall at 618 being overtopped at some point in this process? And so we do that analysis and we send it into FEMA, and they give us a letter that says, conditionally, we agree with you that this provides the protection that we would need. That is not a guarantee, it is just that, it's a letter, and we would have to go through a full risk analysis on this. We actually just received new guidance on how the Corps of Engineers is going to look at these, which is, we're trying to get some better understanding on what that means and how often that will be impacting projects such as these. But it is something that we could look at doing, but we cannot guarantee it. We can just get you a conditional approval.
And what's the earliest point in this process that you could ask for that?
So we could start that process now if you guys wanted to, prior to moving past 50%. It is an extensive process. It takes several months to go through that, and it is an expense that we would have to incur doing the analysis. We'd have more hydraulic analysis that we'd have to do. We'd have to get all of our engineers to do more stability analysis, as well as looking at how this works through the risk register and through the risk that's being asked of us through this new guidance that we got from headquarters.
And if I remember correctly, if we asked you to do that, and you did the analysis, and the ultimate decision of the board was to not move forward with the project, we would be on the hook for that cost. Is that right, or no?
Well, you'd be on the hook for 35% of that cost, because that's the cost sharing. Because I believe your agreement with MWRD is that they will bear the costs as long as you move forward to construction. However, if you back out of the agreement, then the 35% will be charged to you. You'd have to repay MWRD, is my understanding.
Would it be possible for you to give us an estimate on how much that process would cost?
Yes, I will work with my engineers and we will look at how much that process would cost, and we can get back to you on that.
Thank you.
And this flood insurance relief can be pretty significant for people that live in areas that flood like this area does. So it could represent a pretty significant cost savings to residents in this area. So to look at what are we talking about when we're saying that we are not raising flood levels? So this side over here is the Des Plaines River. This is Park Avenue over here, and this is the ground level between those two areas. And it's in that area. Let me go back one real quick. It's in this area right here. So that red line represents the ground level going through this area. This light blue line is with the levee in place, and this dark blue line is what happens without the levee in place. You can see that there's a very slight difference between these two, but this represents less than 0.04 feet, which according to IDNR regulations, 0.04 feet equals no impact or no change in the flood levels. So we meet the requirements for this to be permitted by IDNR, and this does represent a no change in elevation for the flood, the 100-year flood that is represented by this model. Any questions regarding that?
I do. I'm sorry, I don't understand. So,
Yeah.
if the water, I'm just thinking, I guess maybe you could explain the science behind this a little bit more, like explain it to, you know, somebody who is totally brand new to this.
Okay.
So when I'm looking at the flooding, the water, you know, goes over the levee right now, or the wall, or whatever we have. So if we raise that wall by 2 feet, the water wouldn't go over it, but it would go downstream.
Right.
So the water goes somewhere. So help me understand why.
Where does this water go?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, what we're looking at here, when we wall off this area, the amount of water that comes in here does not significantly raise the flow that's going through this area. In other words, this amount that you see up here is so small it's almost immeasurable. Like you wouldn't be able to see it. What we have happening here is this is an area that acts as just a pond. There's not water actually flowing through here. It just fills up and it just kind of sits there. And so you have a very small amount of water compared with the amount of water that's out here. And so when we keep that from going in here, you don't see it actually increase. It just keeps moving on by.
Mr. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Could I ask you to come up to the microphone so that folks at home can hear?
Sure.
So, my name is Colleen Toriumi. I live on Maplewood. My concern is this. This is water that flows east from the river, and the wall is going to be right here. So when that water flows east and south, that water, we've seen it when it's flooding, and the water is actually, it has a lot of movement to it, and it's actually pushed down fences right here. And so I find it really hard to believe that this water is going to say, oh, okay, well, there's a flood wall here. So we won't build up anymore and go into the sewer and, you know, create a new floodplain right here. I just think that is beyond, you just have to suspend belief to buy that.
Mr. Zucker, would you like to address that?
Sure. So,
Thank you, Colleen.
So originally when we had looked at this, we thought that this might be an issue, right? And so the village had actually asked us to go back and look at it and to dig into it deeper. Normally what we do with this scenario is we look at one-dimensional flow of water. And there's a newer type of modeling that's called two-dimensional. And so the village asked us to look at that, and so we went back and we ran this with two-dimensional modeling, which gets down into the nitty-gritty of all of the details in the small areas like this. With one-dimensional, you see a lot of information in the main channel, but not much outside of it. But with two-dimensional, we get more into the outside banks. And what you see here is that the actual flood level, the 100-year flood level, or the annual chance of exceedance of 1%, doesn't change when we remove this small portion of relief. There is flow going through here when it has a chance to flow down and into this area, but at some point that equalizes because it reaches the same height as it does here, and then it stops flowing. And so what we have when we put the flood wall in here is we're putting it at the equalized level. We're basically saying, this is full, you don't have a chance to go in here. Because when you get to the very top of the flood, what we see is that this doesn't flow through anymore. This doesn't keep flowing into here, and so we're putting it at that top of flood earlier than what it would if it was to actually flow into here. And that is why you don't see increases in this area. We don't actually see 616 become 616.1, it stays at 616, And this is where the 616 level of ground is located, and it doesn't go up now out of that. Yes.
So are you saying that the flow that she said she's seen there?
Yes.
That is because this area on Groveland
Mm-hmm.
is like a bowl and it was attracting the water?
Yes.
So
It's like a
the
bowl that
flow-
fills up.
Okay.
Yep.
So then what you're saying is if you put a rim there, there's not gonna be more flow
Correct.
that would go elsewhere?
And that's demonstrated right here by this kind of like peak in the terrain here. You see that it kind of stays the same, and then all of a sudden it flows over there. But when we put that wall there, it just stops flowing instead.
If you could go back to the next slide, just so I understand the explanation of how the water above the Park Avenue wall doesn't spread on. Is that because the topography of the additional land, because so it's higher and forms a bowl? So once the bowl is filled, it's not going to materially go beyond that?
Correct. Yep. So all these areas out here are above the 100-year flood level, and so it's not going to. We're not going to change the topography, and so the water's not going to go where it can't go. It always seeks its own level, and so we're just saying this bowl back here is no longer available, and it just keeps on moving down.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Please.
Yes.
Thank you. The name top.
It'll bubbles.
Peter Schoenman, 235 Maplewood Road. I have a really basic question. So we keep talking about the, oops. Did you do that?
Yeah. No problem.
The top button, you said.
The top button is later.
So we keep talking about the 100-year flood, and that and your standard for building has to be off of the flood elevation, and that has been established as
The 616.
615.3.
Or sure.
Okay, 615.3. So where is, if I point to here at the top of the levee, what is that base flood elevation?
So that would be that 615.3.
615.3.
Whichever it appears to be is that at that location. Yes.
Well, the official FEMA flood map shows 615.3 as being just north of the Forest Avenue Bridge. Oops. So right around here is 615 at the, it's called the W marker, right?
Right.
So when you did your modeling, this water is at 615.3, right? So does that mean up here, that's what this model is showing, 615.3?
We would have to look at exactly what each one is. That, like you're saying, this W
Mhm.
represents the 615.3, so
Right.
there could be slight variations in that, but the topography is generally flat, so we would expect it to be approximately 615.3.
Okay, so this modeling then, that chart that you showed that showed it didn't have an impact, that was 615.3?
Well, if you go to the next slide.
Right, I'm just asking, but that would be the standard that's the standard
Well,
flood.
So this is the modeling that we use. I don't know what modeling FEMA uses for their maps.
Okay,
So, because we used the modeling update that was requested, the two-dimensional modeling, and I know these maps were put in place prior to two-dimensional modeling.
They were
So
do-
you're gonna get a difference in elevation from that. You
Okay.
could get a difference in elevation.
okay, except the IDNR did a survey, the last known survey for this section of the Des Plaines was done in 2009. And they came up with completely different base flood elevations.
Okay.
You know this because, well, you were copied into a letter, right, that the director of the Department of Water Management at IDNR wrote me, and for some clarification, he said the base flood elevation was 615.3, but he's sort of contradicted himself because nowhere in his report does it say 16 or 615.3. Nonetheless, they stood by their work. So I was also wondering, how are you incorporating their data?
So
Which
there's
is the most recent data.
right. So we utilize their models to build this 2D model.
He told me that you had the better models.
Right, and we went back and they had more information that we utilized in this newer model. This
Okay.
the 2D model that was requested of us.
But their information shows base flood elevations of 616 all through here. Not 615, but a foot higher. And we still haven't gotten clarification as to why that is. So I plotted it. I don't know if you can get a picture of that. But when they did their study, they used markers called river mile markers, right? Not the old FEMA markers, which were lettered W, X, Y, Z, etc. And they also said that the base flood elevation for the Groveland strategic project was going to be 616.39. And would you agree that the best practices for hydrologists and engineers is to, if you build a levee structure, you want that base flood elevation to be at the northern point of the structure, right? That's where it matters, right? I mean, you don't take your base flood elevation down river where the river's lower. That doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
And yet, on FEMA, 615.3, the exact number you're using, is right here, 100 feet south of where your
Well,
proposed levee is going to.
So the level that we came up with is up here. So that's 614.5 down here. So probably 615.3 with this model.
Right, that's curious.
So, sir, what is your, I mean, I don't want to get into it in the weeds, arguing
Well,
about modeling.
my
What is your
point-
question?
What my point is, the same question you have. You want this to be an accredited structure. It would benefit everyone in the community if it were an accredited structure.
Correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's on the village. When this thing is done, said and done, and when it's up, the village goes to FEMA to say, can we get it accredited? And they're gonna say, okay.
The
where's your
accreditation
survey?
process is part of our process with the village. The village requests us as a local sponsor to submit on their behalf, and it is included as part of the process.
Right, but I mean, if it doesn't pass muster, there's no recourse for the village.
But that was the discussion we just had that was initiated by Trustee Peters. They're going to get us the information about how much that provisional accreditation or conditional accreditation would be.
Right.
So believe me, we want the answer to that question as well.
Well, you know, I looked at some of those regulations also, and it said that if there's a bridge where this levee structure, passes through, not only is there 3 feet of freeboard, right? Is that the term?
3 feet.
You have to add an additional foot on top of that for a bridge.
Right.
So it's 4 feet now.
Well, so FEMA has rules for those that build levees, and then they also have special agreements with the Corp of Engineers in the way that we assess how we need to add freeboard to those. And that's the risk assessment that I was talking about with Trustee Peters, where we're allowed to do a risk assessment and see if we really need that 4 feet, or if we can get away with the 2 feet, which is what we're aiming for. at
So
this
2
point
to
in time.
4 feet is a pretty big discrepancy.
Right.
And,
And a lot of those FEMA rules are based on big rivers like the Mississippi River or other rivers that have much greater flows and that they have much greater discrepancies, or not discrepancies, they have much greater differences in the flows that you'll see over time. And so they build in more risk tolerance for those flows.
So I guess, because I'd like to try to not be here for the next 4 hours
Right.
talking about this.
well, I'd like a survey.
We want to know exactly what you're asking. It is certainly in the village's interest to have this as a certified or accredited project. And so I suspect that the cost is going to come back at a level that we would be willing to take that 35% cost risk to find that out as soon as possible. But that is certainly, that we're very aware of the 2 and 4 foot issue that you're raising.
But seriously, because if it isn't built up to the standard and FEMA decides, you know, to reassess, there could be more people impacted who are everyone's gonna be put on the floodplain despite there being a levee, right? So it might not impact, they might not flood as much, but how are they gonna sell their home? You know, last I heard, it's hard to sell a home that's on the floodplain. So, you know, I think that, yes.
Wait, are you suggesting that by building a levee, we're going to create a floodplain?
No, I'm saying that if it's not accredited by FEMA, they still consider it in the floodplain.
Right, but it wouldn't be an increase. It would be people who are already in the floodplain.
It depends. If they decide to go off of the DNR's 2009 Groveland survey, they had higher base flood elevations. So suddenly, instead of 615, they're at 6 foot higher, right? You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
So everyone across the board in Riverside.
So one question you'd like to answer is what model does FEMA rely upon to make that determination?
Right, because, you know, you guys are you're not working with FEMA. FEMA is not part of this. They're not helping you build this. They're just the,
Okay, we get
they're
it.
gonna judge it.
Thank you for that. Mr. Zuber.
Okay, great. Any other questions regarding this from the board? Or? No? All right. So there have been questions in the past about, does our modeling make sense? Does it actually show what happens out there? And so we took back, this model run looks at the April 2013 flood. And lucky for us, we actually had some aerial photos taken during that flood, and we were able to kind of look back and see, does it actually match up with what we see on the ground? And I would argue that it gets pretty good results. What we see here is we see a dry patch on Forest Avenue across the river, and lo and behold, there's a dry patch over there. You know, it's flooded over here, just like our model shows. It's got water on the road, but then there's this part right here that's just high enough, and we see, sure enough, there it's dry. What about these homes? Do these show that they're supposed to be flooded? Well, if you look in here, yep, there's water in there on the ground in between these homes covering that area. One that's even easier to see actually is these 4 apartment buildings right here, or condo buildings, whichever they are. And we see that there's this little finger on the road. You know, the road gets water, but these buildings don't. And we can definitely see the water is on the road in this area, right where it shows here, and these buildings are indeed high and dry. So we have pretty good correlation. One of the areas that people are most concerned about, though, is this area up here where the modeling is at. And so you see, here's a photo. This house is high and dry. Again, our modeling shows that it's high and dry. We show that over here in these houses, there's not water there. And again, we can see there's no water in that area. It's a little darker in here than when I put this in the thing. It's a little easier to see. But here we have this finger of water on the road, again shown very clearly right here in the modeling. And you can see that there's water in between these homes as it's indicated here on the map. I would say that this photographic proof shows that our modeling is true to its word in what we saw in 2013. And we have pretty good indications that this is actually what is happening out there. So one of the things that everybody loves to know about is how much is this going to cost? So our project costs, our estimated cost right now for the project engineering and design is about $650,000. If we got to construction, we have about $300,000 in construction management fees. That's just to have our people out there making sure the contractor is doing what they're supposed to do. We'd be paying for lands, damages, and relocations to the tune of about $1.5 million. And then our construction overall is expected about $4.7 million. And these are based on the last numbers that we had for Upper Des Plaines project, which was certified back in the 2015 era, and we just escalated those with the current rates of escalation. So that's what we have here. These will be refined further as we get into the project engineering design with an actual cost estimate. We could see these go up slightly or possibly go down. We'll have to figure that out as we go. So we're expecting a total project cost of $7.1 million Federally, that's 4.6 million and 2.5 million in a non-federal cost, which MWD has generously agreed to provide.
What is relocations?
So relocation costs, those generally refer to things like sewer, water lines, things that we come across as we build the wall that need to be removed or relocated. Those get quite expensive quickly, as you have to make the pipe move, or you have to change change where the wall is at, or things like that. So we put a number in there that we think will cover all of those things that we could possibly run across. So right now we have received $500,000 from the federal government. That represents our current 65% share. We sent MWRD a letter, and they were nice enough to write us a check for $269,000, which is 35%. So we're sitting at $769,000 available for this project to do the engineering and design. Totals obligated to date through November 9th, that's the last time we had a pull on our labor dollars, $47,018.31, leaving us a little over $720,000 to go. So what have we been doing for this $47,000? So we did have our team out to survey the site. We brought them out to take some pictures of backyards to look and see what was going on. We've also been working on some designs. We're getting close to having an initial layout that we'd like to share at a future meeting. We're also working on some photo matches, so we're going to take pictures that we had in the backyards and superimpose the wall in them, so you'll be able to see what it might look like if it were actually built. We have some rough drafts that need some work on them yet. One of the things that we would propose to do in the near future is to actually go out and do a physical survey. We think that'll be about $20,000. We wanted to just let the board know that we'll be seeking that moving forward and working on that. It'll help us enhance the actual layout, ensure that we put it in the right places. We'll be able to give much better accuracy on how high the wall might be, and it'll help with the photo matching as well. So we foresee that going out in the near future, where we'd be seeking permission from all of the residents that own the land to get on their land, do the surveys, and we'll be looking at all that information to help build into what we're going to propose in the future.
May I interrupt you just a second? I'm glad that Chief Buckley's here. So a few weeks ago, you went out and the residents graciously permitted you to go back in through there and take a look. Do we need to do this process every single time you want to go out there and do something, or are those permissions adequate for the surveying that needs to be done?
Those initial permissions were for that specific date and time. I would go back again to those residents and meet with them again to let them know the next date and time when that would happen. And whenever Army Corps gives us a date, we would set it up with those residents.
So after the survey, do you foresee needing to do that on an ongoing basis, having access as part of the design process?
No, I mean, generally once we do the survey, we don't have to have our surveyors get back in there. That data is good for multiple years of use.
Because I'd like to try to not inconvenience the folks over there any more than necessary.
Yeah, so we would make sure that whatever we would need would get done with that one survey. We'll work with Chief Buckley on getting those permissions to do that.
Thank you, Chief.
So then our proposed schedule. So right now what we're looking to work towards is to finalize the alignment with working with the board and the residents sometime this spring, if at all possible. We would have a final engineering and design, we transition into final engineering and design, which we anticipate going from whenever that finalized alignment, about approximately a year's worth of work. Most of that year's worth of work is to coordinate well with our real estate acquisition, which we anticipate taking to 12 to 18 months. And that real estate would be whatever we would need to build and construct the wall. There's a permanent piece of that that would become village property to have the wall built on, and then there's a piece that would be just a construction easement that would go back to the owners, but they would get compensated for its use. Then if we were to follow that, we could award a construction contract sometime in the fall or winter of 2021 with a possible construction beginning in the spring, summer of 2022. Anticipate approximately a 2-year construction timeline. So at end of summer 2024, we could have a complete wall built for it.
Can you go back a couple slides? No, I'm sorry. The one where you show project cost
Yes.
estimates.
Yep.
So the acquisition cost, the real estate acquisition, is that the 513?
Yes. That and some of the relocation funds, they cross over a little bit.
Trustees, do you have other questions for Mr. Zuber? Mr. Hanna?
Well, I guess my question's sort of two lines. In addition to the Groveland project, I'm just curious as to what other levee projects are going on along the Des Plaines that may be before or behind this project.
Yeah, so the Upper Des Plaines project itself has 3 additional levees that are proposed for construction, along with 2 reservoirs. Those levees are in Franklin Park, Villa Park, and Des Plaines. They are authorized by Congress. We currently do not have funding to do any work on final design and construction of those projects.
Okay. And those are all upriver from Riverside?
They are all upriver, correct. And they're much longer in length. The Des Plaines River, one in Des Plaines is approaching 2 miles in length. The Villa Park is approximately 1 mile, and the Franklin Park is probably just under 1 mile.
Okay. And then, I don't know if this is a question for you or for President Sells. I'd like to get a handle on sort of the cost sharing. And my understanding is we get to a certain point to say no or no go on this. And if we say no, then we have to reimburse Metropolitan Water Reclamation 35% of their costs.
35% of the total cost.
Total
so right
cost.
now,
Okay.
if you look at $47,000, if you said no today, you would owe 35% of $47,000, which is.
Got it. Okay.
And you're
I can't do it that fast. Sorry.
So our decision would be made at the end of the design phase, right?
At the end of the 50% design phase, which we had originally talked about last year, somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 to $300,000. We've been very frugal so far. We've been spending at a pretty low rate and trying to save the village as much as possible before we get to this go, no-go decision. And we're trying to bring them specific costs to you to make sure that you understand what we're trying to do and how we're using that to get to that 50%
Can you go
decision.
to the previous slide of this?
Yep.
So are you talking about the 659 figure
Yes.
then? When you get to 50% of that is when?
It's approximately. Yeah, it's not exact, and we're trying to minimize the amount of money that we spend. We have a lot of processes that we go through. I've tried to put some of those off, like developing a project management plan, risk register, things that cost us a little bit extra money, but we don't really need right now to make this decision. So we've set some of that paperwork aside, and we're trying to just do the engineering part so that we can get you guys in something that you can look at and get an answer on, or make a decision on, basically.
I mean, I know that, and I'll just speak from my perspective. I mean, I think that before we can make that decision, we're going to need to see that conditional analysis done with regard to FEMA and the floodplain and the insurance issue.
Okay.
Because that's going to be a major benefit to the residents in the existing floodplain. So, in terms of timing, do you see that being able to be accomplished
by the spring?
By the time you get to 50% of your design?
It may push our schedule a little bit. I could definitely see that happening. It does, so we have to submit an analysis. So we have to do an analysis, and we have to submit it to FEMA, and they get a chance to ask questions and kind of go back and forth. There's no public review period, so that saves us some time. They just make a determination, write us a letter. But that could be 4 to 6 months from when we initiate. But I'll draw up a scope of work. We'll put together a timeline of when we expect that to happen and how much we expect it to cost. Okay. And we can present that to you, and you can decide at that point in time what you'd like to do.
And President Sells, I'd echo that as important to the decision, because if this does not result in a relief from required flood insurance, I'm not quite sure what the point of this exercise is.
Well, the point of the exercise is to relieve from the flood.
Well, the 100-year flood. I loved Chief Buckley's presentation that he did with the pictures from the 2 floods that we have, and I would say fortunately or unfortunately enough to be in Riverside for both of those, and they were awe-inspiring on the power of nature. But, I think of what we're asking the residents to go through who live along there, this becomes a very easy analysis if we can confirm or get that conditional assurance that there'll be a relief from the flood insurance.
I agree. Further questions on this side?
I have
Mr. Collins?
I'm wondering if there's any further public comments before we.
Yeah, we're not going to leave this yet because I had one other question. Did you have anything?
Not at this time.
Anything, Ms. Peters?
I have just two minor-ish questions. Trustee Hannon brought up a good point about the 3 other projects upriver. I think you said with our flood wall, if we added a flood wall here, it would not, we've talked about this, not increase, or it would be like 0.04, which doesn't count.
Right.
With longer projects upriver, is that going to create more of an issue here in Riverside if we didn't do anything?
If you didn't do anything, yeah. So those projects are subject to the same exact rules, and to go with those 3 flood wells, we actually have 2 reservoirs that we'll also be building.
Okay.
Those 2 reservoirs provide the compensatory storage necessary to construct those walls, and they also have a little bit of bonus storage in them that gives a little bit of flood relief as well. But they're economically justified as part of the flood wall projects to provide that storage.
But those all don't have 0.04 plus 0.04 plus
No.
0.04 that we're adding up to?
Right.
Okay. Second question was, how did you determine 2 years for construction?
So that's just an estimate at this point in time. When we do a thorough cost estimate, our cost estimators will look at how long each of these segments would take to construct. In general, we started around 2 years, in thinking in terms of construction. For something like this, it's pretty extensive in terms of amount of work that has to be done. It is possible it could be shorter, and it could be incentivized to be shorter as a part of the process.
It's just, I'm assuming the other projects along the river are not in people's backyards, or not all of it is in people's backyards.
So segments of the Des Plaines one are for sure. The ones in Villa Park, there's a few, and then Franklin Park, I believe a majority of it is in along the river where it's mostly forest preserve lands.
Okay. It's just something I think a lot of our residents are gonna care a lot about, 2 years of construction, so, okay, thank you.
Any other questions before I ask mine? Just one second, so let us get our questions, then we'll open it up to everybody that's here. So I'm still not quite clear on what the 0.04, which is about a ½ an inch, what is that applied to? What does that refer to?
So the 0.04 is the regulatory limit that the state of Illinois has determined is equivalent to 0 or no.
No, but what are we measuring? When you say Groveland levee max, Groveland existing max, what is that? What are you measuring there?
The water surface elevation. The difference between the 2 water surface elevations. So, in other words, this blue line is I pushed the wrong button. So this dark blue line is the water surface elevation as it is now. And the light blue line is what we would expect the water surface elevation to be with the wall in place.
So you're saying with the wall in place, the water surface elevation would raise about ½ an inch, 0.48, whatever, something like that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the base flood elevation at the top of the levee is already more than 315.
But you'll see out here at the river, this is the Des Plaines River, remember, they actually merge together.
So the other question that I heard from a resident is a concern about the certainty of federal funding. I can't imagine why anybody would have questions.
Why would
about
anybody question certainty of
Right.
federal funding?
So is
Astounding.
it possible that this project could get underway, and to Ms. Peters' point, you're a year in, and then all of a sudden the funding gets yanked?
So the nice thing with the Continuing Authorities project is that they give us a lump sum up front when we start the construction process. So we have, as you can see from the money we have on hand, we have enough to get through. 659 is what we expected. We have more than enough to get through project engineering and design. There's a little buffer built in there. Then when we get to the 100% or close to the 100%, we will be forwarding a request to headquarters for the full amount of this contract. And we would have that in hand prior to awarding the contract, along with a buffer that will allow us to do any modifications. It'll also pay for all this construction management, anything further that's needed in engineering and design. We get that all in one lump sum, and as long as we're moving forward in construction, we're not holding on to it and not awarding a contract. That money stays in our district and stays with this project.
Okay. Questions from the folks who are here? Please step up to the podium so that you can.
My name is John Mack. I'm one of the Hoffman Dam River Rats. Can you tell me what the elevation of the underside of the Forest Avenue Bridge is?
I don't have that information with me right now. I could look it up for you.
Because it seems to me, I mean, I canoe that area all the time, and the Groveland dike right now is about at the height of the underside of the Forest Avenue Bridge, by eyeball. I mean, I work with dimensions all day, my eye's fairly good, okay? And my concern is if you wall it in on that east bank and the water gets up against the Forest Avenue Bridge, goodbye RB High School. Because it's gonna go west, and it's gonna go west in a real big way. And RB High School already has a field house they can't use every spring because they have to pump the water out of it. And that's just normal spring.
So if I can interpret your question, so you're suggesting, you're imagining a scenario where it would overtop the Forest Avenue Bridge?
Not overtop it, get up against it, which means that now it's gonna divert in a westerly direction toward First Avenue. Because you're only gonna get so much flow in the opening no matter what. And when it gets up against it, then it starts to flow sideways.
Well, let me add on to his question then, because and this is another concern I've heard from folks. The idea of having the barrier on Forest Avenue, which would only be used in a situation when Forest Avenue, the bridge was overtopped. What would it go west? Are you by having that plan, are we forcing water west of First Avenue?
Right, so the model itself has the bridge heights in it. So part of the model is looking at the cross sections available. Each bridge crossing has its own cross section because of bridges are a restricting factor.
Yes, they are.
And so the model knows when it reaches those bridges that things change. And so what we can see by the fact that there's no change between this picture and this picture is that putting this in does not cause the water to reach the level of that bridge, because it would otherwise it would show up. So it is part of the model. The exact height, exact surveyed height of those lower levels of the bridge are in the model, and it accounts for that in this process.
Well, my concern is if the water gets up against the bridge, then the problem is it also makes it go up in elevation. It not only goes west, if your wall keeps it from going east, it's gonna go west, and it also gets up in elevation because the bridge is acting as a dam and restricting the flow.
So if it gets to the bridge level, with or without the wall, the water would definitely rise.
Because we experience this on the Santa Fe Bridge at 47th Street all the time. They actually have to park engines on the bridge because they're afraid the current up against it's gonna wash it away. So they have to put additional weight on it.
How close did it get to that level in 2013?
I don't know, I'd have to go back and look.
But it didn't get to it though, right? But it was still right below the bridge?
No, I've seen it above.
It licked the bridge.
I'm sorry?
It was licking the bottom of the bridge.
Okay.
Plus, we have all the debris that's also flowing and
Right.
it blocks everything right there.
Right. Okay. Is that all, Mr. Mack?
Well, like I said, that's my concern because, like I said, if it does go west, First Avenue and RB and that whole section of Riverside on the other side of First Avenue are now gonna be buying flood damage repair cost.
But to your point though, if we had a situation where we had a flood higher than 2013, let's say it went up another 6 inches, the river, so that it did hit, it was hitting the vertical surface of the Forest Avenue Bridge, you're going to have that situation anyway, with or without the flood wall. Because to your point, it's the restricting function of the bridge that's causing the increase in elevation and the westward flow, not the flood wall south
yes,
of it.
but the problem is the new river technology is give it someplace to go, not wall it up. You have the perfect opportunity on the west bank to alter that and probably eliminate your flood problem between Forest Avenue and the Burlington Bridge for sure, if you did some modification on that bank over there. Now, why everybody refuses to look at that, I don't know. The Burlington Bridge is a really bad obstruction, and everybody just bypasses it like, I don't even want to deal with it. And I think that's the problem. They don't want to deal with it.
I don't think that's accurate. My understanding when we talked about this earlier is that the scenario that you're talking about was fully discussed with regard to, you know, one is forest preserve property, the bridge, but that was not ignored. That was
we've been
discussed.
dealing with this Burlington Bridge problem since before 2008.
Right.
This has been a constant problem. And I believe seriously that the riverbank was altered after the bridge was built. And that's what's causing your problem. So I don't know. I mean, to me, my question is when you start putting a flood wall in people's backyards, I think that's totally the wrong way to go. I think that there's a way to solve this problem without doing that. Now, I'm sure forest preserve is going to be a permitting problem, DNR is going to be a permitting problem, but it can be overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
President Sells,
Yes,
can I just
please.
ask for clarification? When he said Burlington Bridge, does he mean Forest Avenue Bridge?
Right, Forest Avenue Bridge.
Oh, you mean the track?
Oh, you mean the track?
The railroad.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. You mean the actual trestle
About the
itself.
elevation on the Forest Avenue Bridge.
Where is the Burlington Bridge?
It's
The
Right
track.
south,
Could I have
South.
one answer, please?
right south of Forest Avenue. You're looking at it when you go over
front of
Forest
Ben's
Avenue
house.
going east.
The train track.
Oh, the
Right on
railroad
the
bridge. Railroad bridge, okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mack, I got confused when with regard to forest. Other questions and comments from anyone? Please, ma'am.
Hi, Kathy Flaherty, 215 Maplewood, where I've lived for 34 years. And one more thing, I just want to say one thing before I even start, is that if you are coming into Riverside, a new person, and you came and you saw that Groveland berm, Levee, then you saw the one on Park, I would make a U-turn right out of Riverside. Because why would you want to live here when there's all this, you know, you could live in Hinsdale and not worry about flooding all the time. This is going to affect, I mean, I thought the whole thing with doing any kind of water treatment is that it's not going to affect somebody else. I feel it's going to affect where I live on Maplewood Road. Also, I have this, that's just one thing. I have a article that was in the Tribune back in May. And it is talking about the Mississippi River. But you know what? A river is a river and water is water. And some of the comments that they have with this, because of course on the Mississippi, there are all kinds of levees there. And there's so many things that they talk about. They talk about how levees have dated back to 1852. Sorry, you know what? I forgot my glasses. I'm wearing my neighbor, so I'm kind of struggling with my vision here. It says progressive levee construction would make flooding worse within the river valley. Okay, that's just one thing. It also talks about with natural floodplains blocked, okay, which is what John Mack is talking about. You know, when you block something, all you're going to do is the water will spill out where it finds openings, okay? Often in unprotected areas or where the levees have been raised, which we're talking about doing on Groveland. We're raising that levee, and they're going to be raised as high on the other side. So what happens, you raise these levees, and the part that's not protected, you know, that's where the water goes. Trustee Evans, you talked about the Groveland levee. That's never been breached. That levee has never been breached. So we have a levee right now that's never been breached. So they're talking about raising it, and then adding this other levee, which is totally going to affect all of us over here. Can you get back to that one where you had the little circles and you showed where everything was?
This one.
Next one. Oh, okay, then it must be.
No.
Okay.
This is you. This
Okay.
is Maplewood, right? I think.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So you have. You went across
This is
it there.
that one.
This one. Okay. Okay. So here's Maplewood here. What it doesn't show on Maplewood, and I don't see this is. We have to go even further down on Maplewood, which is, you know, over here, which runs parallel. Right now you're in a curve here on Maplewood. The whole rest of Maplewood is running parallel to the river. And so say right about here, and I live across the street from the river. I don't live on the river side of the river. But I'm concerned because in the years I've lived here, 1987, 1988, 2008, 2013, what we had is water coming from the river, going into our neighbors' yards, and almost coming to where the sewers are in the street. We had to sandbag, and we sandbagged, I believe, 3 times. We had to sandbag so that between where 2 houses were down here, so that the river did not come into the street, go into the sewers, and flood all our basements. Because whenever we've had sewer backups, and we've had a lot in Riverside and on our block, we get water in our basement. We don't have a sump pump because the only time we get water in our basement is when the sewers fill up and cannot, you know, handle the water. If you build, you know, this, you know, the one on Park over here, all that's going to do is push all that water. I know he says it's going to go, you know, John's right, it's going to go to the west, but it's also going to back up and come back into our neighborhood over here. So I just don't think you solve a problem and cause other people's problems. And if you're going to not even get, you know, FEMA to say that this is going to, you know, relieve people and have to pay their flood insurance, you know, not have to worry about the flood insurance, I don't really see the whole point of it. So I think we really need, you know, I mean, before we spend any more money, I mean, I would love for you all to take a vote tonight and say, you know what, we're done. There's just so many things that could go wrong with this project. 2 years of this project going on in the neighborhood, you know, I think it's just a total waste of our tax money that we're putting out there.
May I ask a question as a follow-up to that? What would you say to the people who live south of Park?
I feel bad for them, but I don't want our neighborhood to become what their neighborhood is now.
But you heard Mr. Zucker's explanation that if that's a bowl and it fills up and the water did not take the route that you're concerned about.
The only thing,
in other words, you don't believe the model.
I don't believe the model,
okay,
because I've lived through all the different floods, and I've seen where. So I've seen where, you know, where you have, you know, where you want to put the new levee on Park, where right just north of there, the water had already come onto the land. So now you put this big structure here, and where's that water going to go? I mean, yeah, it's going to go west, but it's also going to start to back up into our neighborhood. So, you know, I don't think you should solve one problem to create another problem.
Thank you. Please.
Monica Munter, Moretto on Maplewood as well. My question is, at what point does that Parkland, or Park Avenue, become a dam for Maplewood? At what level does the water have to reach and before it does back up in our neighborhood? And is it possible with the rain events that are getting worse and worse that it is probable to happen to us, where it becomes a dam now for us? So we're talking about the 100-year flood, but we are seeing nationwide floods that are way beyond normal. So at what point are we protecting them and creating more problems for us and everyone to the east in Riverside, which is, will that FEMA exercise where they're going to look at, are they in the floodplain or not, will that extend through the whole of Riverside, or are you just going to look at where we're trying to protect? Because that's my concern too, that it's not, it's going to be town-wide.
Great question.
Yeah, good questions. So we looked at the 100-year flood. We did not look at anything beyond that. I would have to go back and look at the next level. Usually what we look at next is a 500-year flood. We'll have to look at that and see what level that would get to. We could run that. It's not part of what we normally look at, but we can look at it if the board would like us to. So I don't have an answer for when that would back up and flood over there. It's going to depend on what the elevations are along here and at what point the water reaches those elevations. I mean, I can never say never because everything's possible. It is always possible that the water would get to a higher level. But if the water got to that level at a 500-year flood, let's say, what you would see is you would see the same impact as what you would have with this in place. Because again, we're not raising water levels based on our model. And so even though the water is higher at a higher flood level, that's when it would also impact you normally. So you would see the same result with or without the wall.
I thought your model, you ran through it with like a timeline and showing it,
Yeah.
and it looked like it became a dam at one point, where it wasn't.
No, so what it shows is, here, we'll go back.
I mean, it was like a video that it showed
Yeah, so the
times ago.
Right, and the videos unfortunately don't work tonight, but what we see is that this doesn't change, and that's what this is showing. The water level doesn't change when we put that wall in place.
But,
Yeah, and then the higher level, you're going to get the same issue. You're going to have water at a higher level throughout this area, right? And it's not going to change because this wall is in place.
well, let me follow up on that, because I understand exactly, I think, what you're asking. So you've got a and I really like the explanation you gave earlier with regard to why it doesn't change, because this is a bowl down here, and whether it's a bowl that's reached its level or you have the wall there and it's reached the kind of reached a stasis, which is where it's going to stop flowing anyway, correct?
Yeah.
But I think the question that's being asked is that on Park, that wall is going to be at a higher elevation than the elevation of water in the lower section.
Down
Yeah.
here.
Right? So you're going to create a wall that's higher than that bowl you're talking about.
Right.
So I think her point is, if you have the bowl and you have a higher flood, that water has somewhere to go south and down river. If it's higher, then the wall, the levee, or the wall would in effect become a dam.
I see what you're saying. So
is that right?
What we're creating here is a even elevation along Park Avenue of 618, right? That's the goal with this, with putting in this wall. And so what you would have is you still have, even though we have this wall in here, what would happen is that water would eventually connect through here along this side of this house along the wall and flow back in. And so you wouldn't see a damming effect where you would have just water piling up. Water would seek its own level and find its way either back to the river or back to higher elevations in this direction.
So you're saying in that scenario, that little island house that sits there would become a drain?
Yep.
Are you sure of that?
That's at 618.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
What about 670?
Go.
Mr. Jason?
So that land that's between, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
That land that's between the Forest Avenue Bridge and the trestle on the
Down
west
here.
side, yeah, that's not covered?
Yeah.
Is that just because it's higher ground?
It's just higher ground.
It's higher ground?
Yep.
So you mentioned, is that Forest Preserve property or is that Riverside property?
Yeah, that's forest.
Oh, it's okay, I was gonna say, because you were mentioning reservoirs, I was like, can you redirect it that way somehow? But
So
that's
you
not
would have
possible.
you'd have to dig it out and lower it to have it, to create a
A
storage
slope,
area. Yeah.
Other questions from?
And you asked another question about, there was one other question you had. FEMA.
Right, will FEMA consider the
so
possibility that we would create a
So
floodplain?
that is part of the analysis that they look at, as well as what does our modeling show in terms of changes in the river elevation. It's a holistic look at this, but they will issue their letter in reference to this area that is protected. But they would take they're taking into consideration what we send them, saying that this doesn't change, this is the only area that changes. And they take a look at it. They have their own modeling experts that take a look at our model, and they verify that our model is showing what it should show. And that's how they issue their letter of map revision.
Colleen, did you have anything?
Right.
All right, which button do I push?
The very top, that.
For the people who are new, the reason we don't have confidence in the model is because initially when Mr. Zucker came to give the presentation, this area here was much larger, and this water here connected, and it connected right to the river. So when we questioned him on that, he said, no, that is what the model showed happened in 2013. And we said, no, it didn't. There was never a connection to from the river to the street. So he went back and he reconfigured things. And he said that there was a glitch between the one-dimensional and the two-dimensional model. Is that correct?
Something along those lines. If you could talk to my hydro.
And so he came back with this new diagram. And so the other things that he said was that the river water never came into the yards and touched the houses, which is not accurate. That has happened. And a number of months ago, we showed on really big boards, we had photographs that showed that the water came right up. I mean, even our attorney's house, the water came right up to his house. And there were other houses down along Maplewood that bump up against the river. The other thing he said was that the river water never went into the street, and it would have had it not been sandbagged. And the other thing he said was that the river water never touched the top of the underside of the bridge on Forest Avenue. And we showed on our photograph boards that yes, indeed, that has happened. All three of those things had happened. That's why we don't have confidence in the model. The other thing that causes me concern is last year, I don't know when, but it was at a meeting, so it's on the video. I said to him, you know, we don't have confidence in this model, and what is our recourse if you build this thing and you create a floodplain north of the Park Avenue wall in Maplewood, an area that has never been on a floodplain. So what if that happens? And he said, you could sue us. Well, you know, that is not satisfactory. We're not going to sue the Army Corps of Engineers. So these are the reasons why we don't have confidence. And these are the reasons I think we should take a pause.
Can I just, please? So when talking about this area here, we had originally thought that this was a glitch, but we've heard from residents that there are some areas back here that do get water, like that you were talking about in terms of needing to sandbag. So we took a look at that, and we're still confident in this being something, but we're just not sure what. So we'll keep looking at that.
If I recall, I thought one of the confusions was where that water was coming from.
Yes.
I think your point was that was not river water. That was rain event water.
Well, we'd have to take a deeper look at it and see. We focused more on this area, then questions started coming up, and so we can look at this again and see. I think in terms of the homes that I claimed not to have water, I think what we're really referring to there is that we have homes along here that haven't reported damages. And that's what we look at. Now, whether that's whether they have had damages or not, they may not have been reported, which means that those were not in consideration when we're looking at trying to resolve flooding situations. So it is possible that they get water up to their homes. Yes, I don't remember saying that they don't. It's very possible I said that, but what we're really looking at here is that these homes do not receive damages, and that's why they were not included in the original analysis of trying for protection.
So the photograph on the left is 2013?
Yes.
So when you refer to a 100-year flood?
Yes.
Was that a 100-year flood?
Yes, 100 and a little more.
If I may.
Yes.
You need to come up so people at home can hear you, please.
Why is the Army Corps modeling, you call it a 100-year flood, but it doesn't match the FEMA map, which is also a 100-year flood? Because the FEMA map, which I used to make this overlay, has the connection from the Des Plaines River to Maplewood Road. Very clear. It's on your website. So again, that area right here, on the FEMA map, it connects.
Okay, let's let Mr. Zucker answer the question.
Yeah. So the FEMA model that was used for that FEMA map is not the same model that we're running here. And there have been updates. We have the latest LIDAR data from the village that were used. I don't know what data was used with the FEMA map, so I can't comment on. It is possible there's a connection there. The data that we have right now doesn't seem to indicate that. That's why we kind of question this, and we're not sure if the 1D, 2D interaction is what's causing that. We can get you some more data on that, but overall, this is a different model than what FEMA uses.
But FEMA's model matters to people who are insured.
Correct, and we will submit this model to FEMA for their use in revising the map. That is what would be utilized for revising the map.
As a takeaway for Peter, is it possible to find out what model they used for that and provide that information?
Yeah, so the model that we originally brought to the board, which is what we call the regulatory model, it's what the Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and others utilized for many years. That was the original 1D model. That's what we originally came to you with, and that was what you asked us to revise to the 2D, which is now this new enhanced model. So it's not the same, but it shows similar results.
But as we talked about earlier this evening, you're going to find out for us what model FEMA relies upon.
Yes, and my understanding is it's the regulatory model, and we can give you exactly what that is. It's probably going to come back with the name of, it's called HEC 1 and HEC 2. It's our understanding of what they use, but we'll double check that and make sure that we have that correct.
President Sells, if I can ask a quick follow-up question. Is part of the FEMA analysis that we're going to go through to get a conditional approval, do they run their own models or do they rely solely on what's submitted? And I'm just confused because you had the conversation that they're not just going to look on the affected area in your blue area on the left. Yeah. But they're going to look at both areas, both above and below the Park Avenue levee to make sure that a new floodplain. And I guess my question goes to, are they going to use their own modeling or solely rely on what's submitted?
So they will rely on what is submitted, at my understanding, and I will have to get back to you if this is wrong. My understanding is they take what we submit and they have their own professional hydraulic engineers that model, look at it, and then analyze it and make sure that it's showing what it should be showing.
Okay, so they just don't take the submitted information at face value.
Well, they do a professional analysis, okay. like we would expect someone to do.
Sure.
You know, it's a double check. We have, you know, most professions, you submit something to someone and they check it over. It's kind of the same idea. You know, if you're a journalist, you submit to a copy editor and they check over your written work to make sure it's accurate. It's kind of the same idea. It's like an editor of models. They will check it and make sure that it just says what it's supposed to say.
And just on that point too, for the benefit of the new trustees, throughout this process, from the very beginning, Christopher Burke, our engineers, have been going over these models, have been vetting the work, no offense intended, but they have been vetting the work of the Army Corps as we've gone along, and they will continue to do so.
The Army Corps appreciates all the extra work that has gone into vetting this. I mean, we are not a stand-up. We know that it's good to have secondary eyes on it and making sure that what we're doing is accurate. And Christopher Burke is a very reputable company, and they do good work, and we're glad that they agree with us at this point in time.
Mary, did you have something?
Laser.
Okay.
Backwards.
Laser's good.
Forwards.
I think that's all I need. Hold that one. Yeah, stay there.
There you go.
Thank you.
So, yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
Yep.
I'm Mary Aronjay. I'm the property owner of 14 West Avenue, and that puts our property right there. And I have one kind of general question for consideration, and it goes back to something John Mack raised. And then a couple more specific questions that are relevant to the people whose property is directly impacted. As I understand it, the point that you made, John, I've read the same thing, that the U.S. Army Corps' position these days is in fact not to build levees. It is to allow the water to run freely. And that is, from a strategic perspective, that has been a shift in thinking in terms of what the modeling has shown in terms of real impact. And to that point, I mean, as a resident on West, I've made it no secret that I'm opposed to this for the sake of what it means to my property. My property. I can only speak for myself. However, I do not fail to see the fact that I would love to see remediation and mitigation benefit for all of these people here. I don't want anyone to suffer harm. But look at this. So we live right there. We watch all this all the time. Look at these models. In both cases, that's high ground. Now, we were part of the conversations where we reached out to BNSF, and let me tell you, they were not having it at all. So the fact that the idea that doing anything along with the River Trestle Bridge was explored is not fully the truth. It's just that BNSF you're going nowhere with them. There is just no moving them, because I tried talking to them, they were. And the IDNR, maybe, I mean, I don't know, I'm not an engineer, but it looks to me like if you did, is it possible that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would consider exploring a non-levee solution that would actually excavate and use this land here as more of a retention pond?
So I can definitely talk to that. So this, as part of the Upper Des Plaines Phase 2 study, was a broader study that looked at the possible locations for reservoirs and such that would relieve flooding, such as what happens here in Groveland Avenue Levee. We had proposed a series of additional reservoirs that were rejected further north. We actually looked at somewhere north of 500 different locations to possibly build reservoirs. Since this is forest preserved land, that's almost always a no. They are in the business of holding land, not holding land to preserve forest, not holding land to prevent flooding. So even if we propose this to them, I'm 100% confident that the answer on that would be no. And they also charge about $10,000 per tree that you cut down, and this is all trees. So the other issue with it is a great idea, and the Corps of Engineers likes to do other solutions whenever it's possible. We love the idea of just letting water go where it should go. But when it comes to life loss and property, we realize that many times the only answer is a flood wall. Because in the case of a reservoir in this location, although it looks really good because it's close, you would fill this up very quickly and you would see about 1/10 of an inch in difference in water elevations for a couple miles up and a couple miles downstream. To build a reservoir large enough to decrease this enough to reduce flooding would be an immense reservoir. It would take several city blocks and it'd have to be very, very deep.
Okay.
And so the expense of that grows very, very quickly. Unfortunately, because the Des Plaines River is so flat, when you build a reservoir, the effects are big in terms of their length, but not in terms of their depth. And so you get a lot of benefits up and down the river for a very small change in water elevation.
Okay. Well, and I will say, thank you for that, Jeff.
Yeah, no problem.
I will say that, you know, to echo Colleen, that we have, and we've spoken about this, we have noticed observational differences from what the models show. So the predictions about what the mitigation would be in terms of actual river levels with the removal of the Hoffman Dam, I can tell you, living right there, in fact, it was markedly different in terms of protecting our property. The 2013 flood did not threaten our property. 2008 sure as hell did, but 2013 did not. So turning from that, and I won't take it because I want other people to have a chance, but I did want to ask, you mentioned something that I don't think I've noticed or heard before. You said that there will be both a temporary construction easement and a permanent easement. I've heard the permanent easement is supposed to be 15 feet, correct?
On either side of it.
And how much is the temporary construction easement?
So the temporary construction easement is based on what we think the equipment would be needed. It can be another additional 15 feet on top of that in various places that we would need.
At what point will the residents whose properties are directly affected by this have some sense of what say we have over what happens to that land? I mean, we will lose property value. I guarantee you. Guarantee you. There's no question. We are not in the flood zone. Flood mitigation, whether or not flood, whether FEMA comes back and says, oh, we're going to redraw the maps and you don't have to pay flood insurance, irrelevant to us.
When you say us, you mean your particular
my particular property, yes. Yeah, thank you. I'm only speaking for myself. I know for certain we will suffer damages to the value of our property. So at what point do we get to say or have some sense of whether or not, with that 15-foot easement, as I understand it, we sign over all ownership or claim to that land. So now, if I want to build a set of steps so that I can, I mean, we have a river deck that's right there. During the summer, we use it every single day. If I wanted to do something like that, what recourse do I have to do that? Any?
Yeah, so you know, one of the things that we had talked about with the village was recreational access to the river, if at all possible, something that we need to look at in our design process. The other thing that we have is we have a process where you can come and apply to make changes to the actual physical location itself. So if you wanted to build a set of steps over it, you can apply to have that.
I want a deck. I want our deck back.
You want the deck back.
We've got a tree that'll come down, a deck that'll come down, and a river shed that will all be gone.
So that we would have to look at. I mean, we do have a process where you can apply to make changes to that location. We'd have to go through the village probably to do that, but we could look at those things.
Okay. Okay. I'm still opposed.
I get it.
Thank you.
Okay, how many other folks have questions? Because we're starting to get, please, sir.
Oh, thank you.
And just before you start, just to remind everyone, this is an ongoing process. What we're doing tonight, we are going to have repeated meetings like this, and if I can just briefly, respond to your question, Mary. When you say, at what point are the residents along West and in Maplewood going to have a voice in this? You have a voice in this continuously. through us because we represent you. And so, you know, I mean, the questions, there were some really good questions raised here tonight. And so, you know, we're in a little bit different situation than perhaps you are. And I appreciate that you say, you know, you're speaking on behalf of yourself and your property. But at some point, you know, all of us up here have to look at that green mass and think about those folks too. So that's why being up here is hard. Okay, I'm sorry, sir.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No problem. Patrick O'Loughlin, I'm on West Avenue, 18 West Avenue. Thanks for saying that. Also, keep in mind, trustees, the value of our properties, I live next door to Mary. The value of our properties will go down with this. And we might have a lot of trouble selling, especially with a 2-year period of construction. I'm concerned about that potential 45-foot area for 2 years, 15 being temporary, 30 being gone. I don't like that at all. Not a fan of the project at all, by the way. Just get that out there in front. I'm worried about the water on the east side of the wall. If we have a rain event like in 2008, what will be done for the water to get out of there? Because all the yard is sloped down the river.
Sure. Yeah. That is a great question. So what we've looked at is we've looked at installing what we call pump stations. And when we were out surveying the backyards, we got to connect with Chief Buckley and Dave about the locations of the current shutoffs. And so we found some great locations to put temporary pump stations. One would probably be in conjunction near the bridge itself, and then the other one, it would be down where there's another pipe that goes out through here. And those pump stations, what they do is they function as the relief valve for the water that collects behind the wall. They pump it out and over the wall so that you don't have any issues with big rainstorms. It assists the water getting out from behind the wall and making sure that that doesn't become a problem. Because you're right, it could be a problem, especially if you have a big rainstorm, and we don't want that to be the case. We don't want the wall to create as much of a problem as it's preventing.
Thanks. Also, the village would be responsible for maintaining that, is that correct?
Yeah, so when the village signed the project partnership agreement, they agreed to sign on for operation and maintenance in perpetuity for the wall and the pump station. And we talked about that previously at other meetings. I think we anticipated that to be approximately $15,000 per year based on the original estimate, and that will be updated as we go through the design process and make sure that we include them in and what that actually means.
Okay. Also, you don't have to go away. You can stay. The construction. I know you're not anywhere near having the design done. Will it begin at the bridge, the train bridge, BNSF, and work its way north? Or is it going to be a continual process the whole 2 years?
Yeah, so I would expect what we'll see in the construction process is that it will start at some point, and then they will pull out as they go, because they're going to have to find a way. We did note when we were out there that there's going to be some tricky maneuvering to get the equipment where it needs to be. We recognize that now, and we will have to plan in advance to make sure that there's a way for a contractor to get their equipment in. But in general, so if we just focus on the wall in this section down here, I would expect that the contractor would start on one end and work their way out, and they will, so that doesn't mean like 2 full years of you having construction equipment in your backyard, but it could take 2 full years to get from here to here, or from here all the way down to here, depending on how the contractor chooses to build the wall. It's possible that you would have 1 summer of construction, but then again, that's also up to the contractor. We work with them on their schedule and how they do that. We give them suggestions and we push them for a completion. Like, we give them a deadline of when they have to be done, but we don't direct them exactly when and where they do the work.
Okay. And then final question. From earlier when you first presented this, I believe it was steel pilings that are going in.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Mm-hmm. How deep are they?
So that's one of the design features that we're working on right now, is how deep those will be driven.
In the consideration of that, how much shaking is going to occur to our houses?
Yeah, so we make sure that when we have those driving, that if there's any structures nearby that would possibly be impacted, we develop a monitoring program for that and make sure that those, that they don't have that impact. And they
This
have,
is all sand.
right, so the
Shapes.
other thing that they have is, they have direct push drives that don't do the vibratory, they just hydraulically
Are you
shove
gonna
it
use
into the
those?
ground. So it would be, we would have a recommendation for the contractor. The contractor usually has the option, but they usually look at what we talk about and what, you know, if we put strict guidelines on what can be done in terms of making sure that your houses are protected, they usually choose the right option.
Okay. And timeline to when you come back to the board with your next proposal, what is your ballpark?
We've talked about coming back in January with some new
Well,
information.
but you're gonna need to get that surveying done before you can
Yeah.
really give us a next meaningful
Right.
update, right?
Yeah, so it'll depend on how long it takes us to get the coordination to be able to get in people's yards and do that survey work, and then we'll communicate with President Sells and Village Manager Jessica, and we'll set something up to make sure it gets out to everybody again.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I just had one final question, and I think we're done with this. You showed the photograph earlier of the steel capping on top of that levee.
Yep. This one?
Yes, the metal there. So in the case of the Groveland berm, there's nothing to prevent the village from actually bringing landscaping in up to that point, right, to the top?
So
On the residential side? So
So
that
when
you
we-
wouldn't see the metal, you would see the same berm you see now, except it would be higher.
Depends on what you could put there. We would have to make sure that it passes regulation. We prefer not to put like bushes and trees.
No, I'm
because-
talking about just the same mound that's there now, just.
Oh yeah, we
raising
could
it up with grass.
raise the ground and put grass on there if it would work. It's pretty steep, so I'm skeptical, but we can look at it and see. It's a good idea.
Anything else? Okay, we
Oh,
have two more and then we're gonna move on. Thank you.
Could you do the same in our yards? Yeah. Level it off to the top of the flood wall?
We will take a look at it and see what we could do, but that would then mean further intrusion on your yards in terms of access and being able to put that material in. But we can take a look at that and see if that is an option.
Yes, sir, please.
Richard Rankin, 73 Groveland, almost 30 years. My house is right there. So I represent the folks, I don't know, maybe there's 50 families, I don't know, 75 families. I stand to benefit greatly from this, but if these people up here get a drop more water in their yards and basements, I won't be happy. So as I see it, it comes down to, and I also, as Mary had mentioned, I was involved with talking to the BNSF. They will not budge. Their lawyers will not. If they would move the pylons to allow the water to flow instead of blocking it, it would make a tremendous difference. We also contacted the forest people. No way. Can't dig that out. To make it quick, we have to either trust or not trust the models that the Army Corps is giving us. Because if these folks get flooded, we're screwed. I'm on the fence with it, to be honest with you. I've been through 2 floods. They're horrendous. My neighbors and I have gone through a lot of hell. We also bought a house by a river, knowingly. Some of us way before the internet, and we couldn't research it. So bottom line is, though, none of us would conscience this if these folks get more water. And I think that's a real important thing to consider for the board. That's it.
I appreciate that very much. I agree with you. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jeff, and anything else then? Okay, no, thank you, appreciate it. So we'll keep everybody apprised as things move along, and we'll try to get that surveying done as quickly as possible.